Hi, everyone. My name is John Kelsen. I'm the Chief Education Officer here at Drisha. Welcome to Mishnah in Depth on Pirkei Avot. This is part of our Bikiyut Mishnah Yomit project. And Mishnah in Depth is part of our Rifka Rosenwein Mishnah division here at Drisha. Rifka was a devoted student at Drisha and a great lover of Mishnah. And this division is sponsored by her family and friends in her memory, and we're pleased to offer this year in her memory and in her legacy. This is the fourth shiur that we're offering this cycle as part of our Mishnah Avot learning. I've been preceded by the first three by my colleague, Dr. Chanan Gafni, who offered three introductory shiurim to Masechet Avot. And I'll be doing the final three in the series. And the first, I know that in the Mishnah Yomit schedule, you're probably ahead of the first chapter in Avot if you're following along. But I wanted to just begin with taking a look at parts of the first chapter of Avot, as they set the tone for the rest of the tractate, and then in the latter two sessions we'll focus more on mishnayot and selections from later chapters of Pirkei Avot. So let me just share my screen and share two mishnayot which I wanted to focus on and bring to your attention from the first chapter of Pirkei Avot. Pirkei Avot, as we know, the first Mishnah of the entire tractate, Moshe Kibel Torah Sinai, traces the reception and the transmission of Torah from Sinai, from which Moses receives it, passes it on to Joshua. Joshua passes it on to the elders to the prophets, and the prophets to the men of the great assembly, Anshe Knesset Hagadolah, who have their teaching, and that's how the tractate opens. The next Mishnah, Mishnah 2, which I have here, and I want to focus on, Shimon HaTzadik, Shimon the righteous, an early Tana, actually known as a high priest in the tradition, a Kohen Gadol. Shimon HaTzadik Haya Mishairei Knesset HaGadolah, was one of the last men of the Great Assembly, so he's living during the period of the Second Temple, during the Bayit Sheni, and he is at the tail end of the period of the men of the Great Assembly, or of the men actually of the Great Assembly itself, and thus he represents a sort of transitionary figure from that period and from there into the later developing period of the tradition, into what's called the Zugot, the pairs, who carry forth the tradition all the way to Hillel and Shammai, and then forward to the house of the patriarch, and also to the students of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Now, Shimon HaTzadik is, again, from the end of the period of the Men of the Great Assembly, and the Mishnah says, Hu haya omer, he was wont to say, he used to say, this represents apparently a major teaching of his. Al shlosha dvarim ha'olam hamed, it's a celebrated Mishnah. Al shlosha dvarim, the world stands, the world rests, omed, on three things. Right? It stands on Torah, Avodah, and Gimulut Chasadim. Right? On Torah, on here they translate the temple service, sacrifices. We might interpret this, more broadly, the world of commandments, as some interpreters do, and Gimilut Chasadim. Here they translate acts of piety. Chesed, Gimilut Chasadim. It's a celebrated Mishnah and a celebrated, therefore, trio. Torah, Avodah, Gimilut Chasadim. We could interrogate the specific meaning of each of these terms. And again, there's various interpretations, which I invite you to look into, as well as the relationship between these terms. What's the intended interplay of these three? I'll just note right now, before getting to Mishnah 18, that the notion of the world being omed, standing upon something, the notion that there are actually literally amudim, pillars. So this is a biblical notion, and elsewhere in the ancient world, just one example of several. Psalm 75 speaks of the pillars of the Eretz, the pillars, the amudim, which in this context of God, have established. And so the world is imagined sort of architecturally as standing upon, being resting upon pillars. And actually, here we speak of three pillars, right? Ashosha devarim ha'olam hamed. Interestingly, we have tripods, images thereof on ancient Greek coins. And so perhaps perhaps Shimon HaTzadik, excuse me, is kind of imagining, right, in the world resting upon three pillars or stands such as this, right? A three-legged table or stool. And speaking of three, I should also note that the notion of, of course, three teachings, right? Here, pillars, that number three also, besides having echoes elsewhere in Pirkei Avot, which is sometimes organized numerically in threes or fives or tens, but again, also in the Bible, for example, from Micha, the prophet Micha, another actually very famous or celebrated passage. Higid adam ma tov u'ma Adonai doresh mimcha. You have been told, O human being, Adam, what is good and what God actually requires of you. Seems like a very sort of fundamental thing to know. And it is here three things: Kiyim asot mishpat, one, two, ahavat chesed, and three, hatznei alechet im Elohecha. Do justice, love goodness, and walk modestly with your God. So I just point this out to evidence the fact that the amudim here, the world standing on three things, is probably sort of an architectural analogy. One, and two, the notion of it standing on three things, right? The notion of boiling down teachings to three also has biblical antecedents. But here the three are not the three that the prophet Micah talks about per se, but rather Torah, Avodah, and Gimilut Chasadim. Okay. Again, some commentators, like the Maimonides, for example, reads this as Torah, right, the pursuit of wisdom writ large, Avodah, mitzvot writ large, and Gimilut Chasadim, of course, acts of interpersonal charity, and that these three represent the range of activities which will yield a virtuous world according to this vision. Now, Mishnah, what's so interesting, the reason I chose this Mishnah to focus on today is that, again, this sort of opens up or almost opens up the first chapter of Avot, in fact, the entire, therefore, Tractate of Avot. And it closes the same chapter with what's basically a parallel Mishnah. Mishnah 18, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Omer. This is a later sage, also a Tana. Mishnaic sage, of course, is in the Mishnah, but a later Tanaitic sage after the destruction of the temple from the house of the Nasi, but also named, interestingly, Shimon. And lo and behold, he teaches Al Shlosha Devarim Ha'olam Omed. He too has a teaching as to what the three things upon which the world stands or rests. But his three are different. His three are Al Hadin, V'Ala Hamet, V'Ala Shalom, on justice, on truth, and on peace. Here, in the version of the Mishnah that we're looking at presently, there's a proof text cited, Shene'emar, from the book of Zechariah, chapter 8, Emet u'mishpat shalom shivtu b'sha'arechem. Execute the judgment of truth and peace in your gates, right? All three are mentioned there. Emet, mishpat, and shalom, different order, of course, but emet, is the second. Adin emet, mishpat corresponds to din, and shalom, shalom. So all three are mentioned in one verse there, and that's the end, and that's the end of the Mishnah in the version you're looking at. So it's very striking that the chapter opens and closes with two teachings about the world standing on three things, although they're different three things, and it invites us to put the two mishnayot into conversation and to investigate the relationship between them. And I invite you to do that actually yourself. What is the relation between the two? Why does the Mishnah open up and close with this first chapter? Let me share some thoughts along those lines. I just want to, before I do that, let me note one thing which will be picked up by some of the Rishonim, which is, I keep saying that in the version of the Mishnah that you're looking at, it says, on three things the world stands. But truth be told, Ha'olam Omed in Mishnah 18, just like in Mishnah 2. But truth be told, in some witnesses and in some versions of the Mishnah known to us through citations and also through some manuscript witnesses, there's a variant, a textual variant, where, for example, if you look at the Machzor Vitri, which is one example, other Rishonim have this as well. Rabban Shimon Gamliel Omer, Machzor Vitri is a sort of a text emerging from the school of Rashi. So it's sort of a medieval Franco, German Ashkenazi liturgical type of tradition, type of text. And there it teaches Rabban Shimon Gamliel Omer. Their version is Al Shlosha Devarim Ha'olam Kayam, on three things the world not omeid but kayam. Kayam in the sense of remains existent, can stand, can remain into the future. Again, la'amod v'lakum are cognizant of one another, but they potentially, this different version where the word kayam might potentially carry a different meaning. Actually, if you look at the Kaufman manuscript, which is our oldest, most complete and very significant, therefore, manuscript of the Mishnah. Here as well, if you see here, Al Shlosha Devarim Ha'olam Kayam. It also has the reading of Kayam. And actually, while we're looking at it, I'll note it says Al Hadin, Al Hamet, Al Shalom, and then you see the sort of a gloss here in smaller print, Shne'emar, and cites the verse from Zechariah that we have above in our Mishnah. But here in Kaufman, in this manuscript, it doesn't seem to be part of the Mishnah itself, but rather a sort of scribal addition. And in fact, in the Talmud Yerushalmi, which you have here in footnote 1, this verse is cited as related to our Mishnah, as explaining our Mishnah. Amar Rabbi Mana, Shloshtan, all three of Hadin, Hamet, v'Hashalom, which are mentioned by Rabban Shimon Gamliel, uva pasuk echad, are all located, can be sourced in one verse. Emet u'mishpat shalom shiftu b'sha'arechem. So it's hard to say for sure, but potentially the scribe here, knows that teaching from the Yerushalmi or from elsewhere somehow, and decides to enter it into the side of the Mishnah in his manuscript, and perhaps at some later point, another scribe sees this gloss, thinks that it belongs to the Mishnah itself, and it becomes, in some versions, incorporated into the text of the Mishnah proper. Okay. In any event, we have here two mishnayot which are clearly in parallel. Either they might both say Ashlosh Adrim Ha'olam Omeid, or the latter might say Ashlosh Adrim Ha'olam Kayam as opposed to Omeid. Either way, they're in relationship to one another, assumedly. Assumedly, the notion of the world standing on things is important, in other words, to whoever's putting the Mishnah together, this first chapter, and wants to stress this. I'll note that Torah and Avodah and Gemilut Chasadim, in one way or another, certainly Torah and Gemilut Chasadim, are topics which are addressed in various ways in the first chapter of Mishnah Avot, right after Mishnah 2. So, in a way, and not to mention later in the Tractates, in a way, this Mishnah, appropriately opens up the tractate and opens up the chapter, right? These three things, the world stands on these three things, and then we'll go on to talk more about some of the ways of enacting this Mishnah, how exactly to acquire Torah, how to study Torah, how to practice Gemilut Chasadim, etc. So it functions as an opening to the tractate. It functions as an opening to the chapter itself, and furthermore, ditto for the Mishnah 18, Al Hadin, for example. Din is judgment, is one of the themes, proper judgment, one of the themes of the first chapter of Avot, heavy mitunim badin, right? That's one of the first teachings, right? That we should be deliberate in judgment and practice judgment and advice or directives as to how to practice judgment properly in one society. Remind ourselves that Masechet Avot is housed within the order of Nizikin, right, which is the order of the Mishnah, which describes not only damages and torts, etc., and zoning laws and which we should live together in society, but also Sanhedrin, right? It's a tractate in which we encounter the structure, the institution, and the people who occupy that great body called the Sanhedrin and the court and such, and therefore teachings regarding din, emet, and shalom are very apropos, not only to the broader society, but specifically within the context of this order of Nezikin to the judges themselves. So let me, with that, turn to some of the teachings of the Rishonim, of the medievals, their understandings of these mishnayot. And let me highlight or contrast the explanation of Maimonides and Ravada Bartanura, respectively, with regards to the meaning of the world standing on three things. And then I'll turn to potential distinction between the world standing on, omeid, versus kayam, on three things. So Maimonides, when he explains Mishnah 1, he says as follows, and I sort of referenced this earlier. He says as follows, Yomar, he is saying, that is to say, Rav Shimon HaTzadik is saying, shebechochma, that with wisdom, v'hiya Torah, and that is Torah. So you see that he's explaining or interpreting or rendering the word Torah to refer to wisdom. Okay, we shouldn't ignore that the interpretive move that he's making there, which is not surprising that for Maimonides, but important to note. And for the elevation or the enhancement of good character traits, and that's how we reach Gimilut Chasadim. Okay. Ushmirat mitzvot Torah, hema karbanot, and avodah, he seems to read as sacrifice, but that he extends to fulfilling the commandments in general. So he says, by doing this, tiyeh hatmadat tikun haolam v'sidor mitziyoto al derech hashalem. By an individual or by a society more broadly attending to these three activities, these three core cultural engagements of pursuit of chachma, of wisdom, of Torah, of character refinement. I assume he also means not only in the sense of a virtue ethic internally, but by virtue of practicing Gimul Chasadim and also by observing the commandments. Okay, the avodah stands in for all the mitzvot in his reading. This will lead to a virtuous world, a refinement, an orderly world, al derech hashalim, in the most complete way, as it translates here. I would say leading the world towards its purpose, towards its refinement. In other words, this Mishnah, in his understanding, this Mishnah is teaching us what allows the world to really operate properly and to proceed properly towards its purpose. That's why he reads Holam Omeid. This is in contrast, I think, to the way Rav Bartanur reads it. Look at his brief comment over here. Lo Holam Omeid, lo nivra ha'olam ela b'shvil shlosha dvarim halalu. The world was only created because of, for the sake of these three things. In other words, the way the Bartanura reads Rosh Shimon HaTzadik's teaching, it's not about what will allow the world to function properly, to proceed towards its telos, but rather what justifies what caused the world to be created in general, right, from the beginning. And the Bartanura's understanding is that the world was created for the sake of Torah, Avodah, and Gimilut Chasadim. Now, what allows the world to actually, enact Torah, Avodah, Gimilut Chasadim, and to move forward towards its purpose, which is articulated in Mishnah 2 over here. So then that's what he gets to when he gets to Mishnah 18. Ha'olam Omeid in Mishnah 18, he says, this reading means Yishuvan shel b'nei adam mitkayem. This Mishnah, Rabban Shimon Gamliel's teaching about din, emet, and shalom, that's referring to the three things which allow the world to be preserved, that allows people to create a Yishuvan shel b'nei adam mitkayem, extant, cohesive, healthy, if you will, society. A society needs din, emet, and shalom in order to be sustained. But those are not the three things for which sake the world was created. Okay, so for Bartanura, Mishnahs 2 and 18 are in conversation, but they're different. Okay, for Bartanura, Mishnah 1 speaks of the purpose of the world, and Mishnah 18 speaks of that which allows the world to continue. Actually, Rabbeinu Yonah, the great Spanish Rishon, says as follows, and here he's speaking about Mishnah 2, but he'll reference Mishnah 18. He says, Hu haya omer shosha devarim ha'olam omeid, v'tzono lomar shebeshvil devarim ha'elu nivra ha'olam. Right, same teaching as Bar Tanura. Right, this means to say that because of these three things, the world was created. Because kilamata hu omer shosha devarim ha'olam kayam. Because below, Mishnah 18 refers to three things which the world, of a bunch of words, is kayam. Assuming like he seems to have that version of the text which reads the word kayam in Mishnah 18 rather than omeid. But those three are different than Mishnah 2. There's a different three. Now, you could say they're debating one another, right? That there's a machloket, if you will, between Rabbi Shimon HaTzadik and Rabban Shimon Gamliel. But he reads it, no, he says they're not, he synthesizes, they're not debating, they're referring to different things. Actually, what he says is as follows: when they said the first three, again, those are these are the things which, for whose sake God created the world. God created the world for the sake of God's creatures, who would eventually, be desired or do desirous things in front of God through these things. And these are the great Amud Gadol. These are the things which represent the purpose of the world. But the latter Mishnah, he seems to indicate, Mishnah 18 talks about the things which allows the world again to be kayam, as we said earlier, allow the world to continue to exist and allow them to function properly. And I want to close with a further gloss on Rabbeinu Yonah, which is brought by the Beit Yosef, by Rav Yosef Karo in his commentary on the Torah, on Choshen Mishpat, the very, very beginning of Choshen Mishpat, which codifies much of the material from Seder Nizikin. And he cites Rabbeinu Yonah, and he says as follows. He says, how are we going to explain the difference between these teachings? He says, perhaps we should analyze these mishnayot with attention to the historical time periods in which they were articulated, or the teachings were articulated at least. He says, Shimon HaTzadik diber kfir zmano. Shimon HaTzadik is speaking to the reality in which he exists. Shahaya Beit HaMikdash Kayam. That's the time of the temple. Shimon HaTzadik, as I said earlier, the high priest, is speaking about, and probably as the high priest is very aware of or focused upon, a world in which there is a temple and all of the sacrificial rite is operating, etc. Rabbanan Shimon Gamliel Hayav Bizman HaChorban. But Mishnah 18, teaching Rabban Shimon Gamliel, that is already after the time of the temple. So what? So he says, Ba'alomar, Rabban Shimon Gamliel is trying to say, She'afal pi she'en Beit Mikdash Kayam be'en lanu avodah, even though we, during the period of Rabban Shimon Gamliel, are speaking at a time after the temple. So we don't have access to avodah, meaning sacrifices, in that definition, that more narrow definition that Maimonides rendered it. And nor are we really fully able to engage in neither Torah nor Gemilut Chasadim in the most robust sense of the terms, because of the yoke of the exile, living in a different reality, a more circumscribed and fraught reality. Nonetheless, he says, there is the potential for the world to still remain existent, to be sustained nonetheless, right, through these other three, din, emet, and shalom, which he argues, domim lahem, which he argues correspond, right, in some derivative sense perhaps, but correspond to the first three, as these three correspond to the three articulated in Mishnah 2, right? Of course, din and Torah correspond to one another, judgment and Torah, rulings literally, emet tikun la'avodah. And truth is, in a sense, he calls it a tikun la'avodah, is a sense a fixing. I think he means, right, it's a quasi stand-in. Practicing truth functions as a quasi stand-in for sacrifice. Because the sacrifices, the mikdash, the temple, allowed God's presence to dwell amongst us. And we know from the Talmud that ushmirata emet, truth, which is God's seal, shehu chotamo shel kadosh baruch hu, right, also, in a sense, enacting truth also evokes or invites God to dwell amongst us. Ve'ala shalom keneged gimilut chasadim, and with peace, which corresponds appropriately to gimilut chasadim, to acts of kindness interpersonally, for acts of kindness, right, facilitate truth. So he argues, in other words, that Rabban Shimon HaTzadik, and Rabban Shami Gamliel are speaking to different realities. Shimon HaTzadik is speaking about the things which allow the world to be omeid, the three, perhaps, things, engagements, centers of rabbinic or Torah culture for which the world was created, Torah, Avodah, and Chasadim. That's a time of sort of cultural robustness, or a time of the temple, time when God dwells in the people's midst, and those pursuits can be pursued fully. Rabban Shimon Gamliel argues the Beit Yosef, argues of Joseph Caro, speaking after the time of the temple, and he's asking, so what now? What allows the world to stand, or the hitkayem, to continue to exist even now? And he argues, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says, din, emet, and shalom, more circumscribed, derivative activities or ideals or virtues which we can pursue whatever our reality. So I'll stop here, but I wanted to draw your attention again to the core question, which is, and to note that the Mishnah and Avot assumedly begins and ends with these three teachings, which are in parallel, in order to invite us to put them into conversation. What exactly emerges out of that conversation? So that's dependent upon the learner, and right, you think of your own possibilities as well. Here I shared a few of the Rishonim. Okay, so this has been session number 4, and next week we will continue our study of later chapters of the Mishnah. Thanks, and be well.